Happy summer, Digication community. We'd like to thank you for your loyal support of the first season of our podcast. After today's episode, Digication Scholars Conversations will begin a brief summer hiatus. We will return in the fall with brand new episodes featuring brilliant new guests, as well as a few favorites from past episodes.
Welcome to Digication Scholars Conversations. I'm your host, Kelly Driscoll. In this episode, you'll hear part 2 of my conversation with J. Elizabeth Clark, a professor of English at LaGuardia Community College. More links and information about today's conversation can be found on Digication's Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Full episodes of Digication Scholars Conversations can be found on YouTube or your favorite podcast app. I was curious. I know you've done quite a bit of writing about HIV and AIDS, and I was wondering if that was an example maybe of that library of ideas. That there was something that created that spark for you, and if it was something that, as part of the process just flowed right away, or if it was one of those things where you kind of had to sit with that for a while and then build what you wanted to express. Could you share what that process was like for you?
Sure. So my dissertation was on the poetry of HIV and AIDS, and it was really looking at because dissertations are very specific moments in time. I
Yeah.
was really interested in the question of how, in 1996, post protease inhibitors changed the language. Of how we talked about HIV and AIDS from essentially being a death sentence to being a
Mm-hmm.
chronic long term illness, and how that was going to affect the political nature of the poetry of HIV and AIDS. Because early on, the poetry was so political, and I would argue it's still political to this day. But how the nature of that political tone shifted. Um, so um, I didn't I don't think that I knew that I was going to write a dissertation on HIV and AIDS. I actually thought I was going to write my dissertation on Carolyn Forche and the poetry of witness, which is
Mm.
something that I had spent a long time thinking about. I wrote a lot about in graduate school and various courses. Um, but I was doing a lot of writing about HIV and AIDS in my own work and my own poetry. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I have two siblings who are adopted, and their parents died of AIDS related complications. So, HIV and AIDS is something that my family has, at least in from the time that I was in high school on, has always talked about. And it's
Yeah.
always been part of our family conversation. And like everyone else, growing awareness and
Yeah.
sophistication with the vocabulary around that, which changed greatly in the 80s and 90s. Um, but so I was doing a lot of writing about our family experiences, and I was doing a lot of processing of our family experiences and what it meant to grow from a family where I was the eldest sister of one to the eldest sister of three siblings,
Yeah.
and how that really changed. And we have quite an age gap. So I am 6.5 years older than my sister. And then when my parents adopted, I am 15 and 16 years older than my youngest sister and my brother. So I was doing a lot of writing about that and about what that meant. My dad is a Methodist minister, so I was also doing a
Mm-hmm.
lot of thinking about some of the challenges that we faced as a family from the religious community about decisions that my
Mm.
parents made. And so I think from there, then I was really interested to see what other people were writing about HIV and AIDS. And so I kind of worked my way into a dissertation that yoked my interest in how writing is always a political act,
Mm.
poetry that I was writing, to then analyzing poetry of HIV and AIDS. So it was a little bit of an evolution, but I didn't go to graduate
Yeah.
school thinking that that was the dissertation I was going to write.
Yeah.
It evolved over time out of a lot of different experiences and conversations.
Yeah. Yeah. And as part of that creating that dissertation, were there some surprises that came up for you about the kind of person that you had become as part of that experience?
That's a really no one has ever asked me that. That's a really good question. Um, I don't think that there were surprises at the time. I was very much writing out of a place of politics and activism and
Mhm.
personal politics. And so I think that my writing was very much mirroring where I was at the time politically, and evolving, right, as a young
Yeah.
adult and trying to figure out the world and what it meant to be emerging as an adult in the world. I think more interesting to me, just in terms of my writing as a process, was that I've published several interviews. So, as part of that dissertation, I was lucky enough that many poets were generous enough with me to volunteer their time, and I interviewed them. So, another piece of the
Oh,
dissertation are original interviews with a number of leading poets who were writing about HIV and AIDS at the time. And I published some of those interviews and some pieces of my dissertation. The full dissertation is not published, but there are pieces of it that appear in publications. And then I was kind of done. I had done what I set out to do. I was really satisfied with it. And I didn't imagine life as a literary scholar thinking about HIV and AIDS. I had kind of set
mhm.
out and achieved what I set to achieve. So
Right.
that was done. Like I was ready to leave that piece of writing. So that piece of writing exists as my dissertation on the shelf at Binghamton. And then I have a copy here. And that was it. Moving on. But I think in terms of the library of ideas, what I see as a real constant throughout all of my work is that I've always been interested in the relationship between science and writing and
Mhm.
how science can inform our writing. So at that time, I was really thinking about medicine and the medical humanities, and now I'm really focused on climate change in the ocean.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, I can totally see
Yeah.
that parallel. Yeah. It's fascinating. Um, have you encountered in your teaching uh, some students that you feel kind of share that um, share that understanding of how science plays a part in politics, and what what kind of connections are you able to have on that um, kind of understanding with your students?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think my students have lots of varied experiences in the world, and lots of varied interests, and many interests that surprise me, things that I never would have thought
Yeah.
about. I do teach a version of our capstone course where I focus on utopias.
Oh,
And
wow.
in that course, we're reading both utopias and dystopias.
Yeah.
And as part of their capstone project, I ask students to create a utopia where they solve a problem that exists in our world today. So they have to do it's a pretty extensive research project where they're researching problems that exist in our world, um,
Hmm.
and then trying to figure out how they would write a world where they can solve the problem and dystopia doesn't happen, right? Where they can think
Hmm.
ahead about the kinds of things that we see happening in dystopias and avoid them. So
Yeah.
it's an interesting logic
What a
problem.
great, yeah. Oh,
Yeah,
that's
it's
so
really fun. It's
wonderful.
really fun, and students really like it. And we do a lot with, how we're going to present these worlds, and and how they're going to present their research and this sort of
Yeah.
thing. I find in that class, my students tend to be really interested in the environment, climate change,
Hmm.
and medicine. So those are the kinds of technologies that I would say dominate those dominate that assignment, where students are really trying to
Mhm.
think their trying to science their way through
Yeah.
those problems.
Mhm. Yeah, I could see
So
that.
that's where I see a lot of that kind of thinking, where students are really taking on the science and the technology and trying to apply it to what they're doing. Maybe less so in my composition classes. It really depends on certainly students have done a lot of writing about climate change in the last several years. Absolutely, all of this year, students have been writing about medicine and healthcare and coronavirus and plagues, um,
Yes.
if they wanted to. That was kind of an interesting space where I was really thinking about how not to mandate that as an assignment, because I wanted students who needed a break from all of that to not have to write
Right.
about it. But I also wanted to create a space where students who needed to process it could.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
was doing a lot of work in the syllabus to figure that out. Um, but I would say I don't see necessarily science as like a dominant theme in what my students choose to write about. But
Mhm.
it definitely, can be there and is there from time to time.
Yeah. So with the capstone, as you were speaking of that about that, I was remembering a presentation that you made that was about the kind of the fundamental differences between an e-portfolio created for a capstone versus one that might be created for first year writing or maybe a
Mhm.
composition course. And I can't remember what year that resource was created, but some time ago. But I would be interested in hearing what your perspective might be on that today.
Yeah. So, I mean, I really have always taken as my guiding principle that the portfolio is a student space. And when I work with faculty and talk with faculty, no matter how faculty feel about their assigned or chosen learning management system, that's our space. That's
Mhm.
our digital space where we create it. CUNY uses Blackboard, and I have enabled the spaceship background in all of my courses when you go in, because it's the most interesting one to me. So that's what it looks like. So whether students like it or not, and whether it is, has any clear parallel to writing, we have a spaceship background. But what I love about portfolio and what I really emphasize is that's a student space, right? That's the student
Mhm.
curated space, it's the student meaning making space, it's the student reflection space. Um, so in there's a conversation, right, between the classroom and the work that we're doing in the classroom and what goes into the portfolio. But at the end of the day, it is a student space. So I'm always really interested in how students translate what we've talked about in the classroom into their own space. I would
Mhm.
say that portfolios in the writing classroom are almost always process based. So I'm looking
Mhm.
for them to show me how, when they leave English 101 or basic writing, and they go into a future class where they're going to have to use writing, but without the scaffolding and structure of the composition class, how are they going to figure that out on their own? So, how are they going to get from the assignment to the finished product on their own? So students take a lot of different paths to show me how that's going to happen, and they have a lot of choice in doing that. And
Mhm.
it's really fun, and it can be a really fun and inventive space. But the writing portfolios are definitely process based, both by design, by the assignment that I am giving them, and by their interpretation of that assignment. The capstone portfolio, I think, is much more, can be a much more focused and showcase kind of space, depending on
Mhm.
the student and depending on their goals and depending on their major. So I teach in the liberal arts, and our capstone course is in the liberal arts. It's called LIB 200, Science, Technology, and Humanism. And in that course, I might have students who are photographers and students who are English
Right.
majors and students who, come from a variety of different disciplines in the humanities. So some of them very much already speak the language of professional portfolios if they're coming from an art background or a writing background. But there are also students in the capstone course who are really interested in continuing that idea of thinking about process, who want to really,
Mhm.
in the capstone portfolio, think about an early piece of work and then this capstone research project that we're doing and how they got to the capstone project, showing their process over time because they're not intending to use their portfolios to get a job. They're really using it as a learning portfolio. So I think
Right.
that
Right.
depending on students' goals in the capstone course, particularly in the
Mhm.
liberal arts, it can look very different. Now, that's different when you talk with our faculty in nursing or in occupational health. Uh, those portfolios, I think, tend to be much more showcase and focused on getting a job.
Yeah,
But in the
and all of that
humanities,
field experience. Yeah.
exactly, exactly. But in
Mhm.
the humanities, I think there's a more there's a wider field to explore and to think about their goals in association with the capstone. But what I
Mhm.
am really looking for in the capstone portfolio and what we do spend a lot of time talking about there is really that capstone reflection. And how are you pulling together what you have learned at LaGuardia as you are preparing to go on to your next step? And how have you
Mhm.
made meaning out of all of these different courses that you've taken?
Yeah. And so, as part of that kind of conversation about the work, do you often have the students within this capstone share their e-portfolios with each other? Um, and if they do, is it, at what stage do you find that helpful?
Yeah, typically in all my courses, when we're working with portfolios, we do gallery days where students are presenting their portfolios. We also share portfolios throughout the whole semester. So in my classes, portfolios are really a living space. So if we are now, obviously, this has been different in the last year because we're online.
Things are a little
Um,
different. Yeah.
yeah, everything's a little different right now. But let's say under normal circumstances, when I'm teaching, I'm usually teaching in a computer lab. So students
Mhm.
are actively working on their portfolios while we are in class. And we have a conversation about this in the beginning of the semester when we're setting up our expectations. But I will ask students to share pieces of their portfolio on the projector so that we're all looking at it
Mhm.
and workshopping it together as part of class. So they are seeing portfolios emerge throughout the semester in the course, and they are actively sharing that throughout the semester. And we talk about it as a changing space, right? It's not about like, oh, you projected this portfolio page today and you had a spelling error and that means something terrible. It's like, oh, you projected your
Yeah.
portfolios page. Is it even going to look like that at the end of the semester? Let's talk about
Right.
like, is that the font you want? Are those the photos you want? Do you want to include video? And so I think that as a community, we really talk in my classes about the portfolio space as this living, breathing space. And then there does come a point where then it's going to be time for me to take a look at it and offer feedback and a grade. Um,
Mhm.
so there is a definite stopping point in the semester, not a stopping point, like a culmination point.
Mhm.
But throughout the semester, it's very much a living document.
Oh, that's wonderful. It almost sounds like it's a bit of a studio environment. It's in a
Absolutely.
computer lab, but it sounds like all the time, student things are being put up and you're having conversations about the work and they're working alongside each other. So that's really exciting. I love
And
that. So when you
they're getting inspired from one another and they're
of
showing one another
course.
stuff and, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. That's huge, and I'm so excited to hear that. With my background and my co-founder Jeffrey Ann's background in art and design, this kind of studio-based pedagogy is huge for us, and we'd love to hear stories of how people are kind of embracing that with the, creating of the work itself, but also in the creation of the portfolio and having that kind of dialogue along the way. It was so crucial to us when we were at Rhode Island School of Design, and it's really fun to learn about different ways that kind of teaching and learning is happening in so many different disciplines.
Absolutely. Yeah. I love thinking about the classroom as a studio space. The classroom as a studio space is just so important, I think, in so many disciplines to think about how we're really applying what we're learning together and learning
Mhm.
from one another.
Mhm. Yeah. So you were speaking a little bit about the culmination point. So when they do have to essentially kind of
Hand it
turn
in.
it in and get a grade on it. Yeah. So could you talk a little bit about what that assessment process is like for you, and also how technology has kind of shifted maybe how that is done, and because I know you've done some articles about that topic as well, and I'd love to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah. I mean, so obviously, I am often experimenting with new things in the classroom and trying new things out. So things evolve, things change. Sometimes I go back to something that I did before because I think it works better than what I'm doing now. Um, Currently, and for the past several years, I'm working with contract grading. As a
Hmm.
department, a number of us read Aseo Anue's book on anti-racist pedagogy and thinking about labor-based contract grading. So I have very much modeled my current grading structure for the past several years on the conversations that we had in the department coming out of that common reading.
Hmm.
So I'm very much privileging labor based work in my classes rather than this idea of this is an A paper, this is a B paper in
Yeah.
terms of the content. And I also think that for me, that fits much better into my ideas about writing. I'm not really sure about these somewhat artificial ideas of this is the best writing, this because I think that all writing could often be better. I mean, I'll read a published book and think, I hate this ending. Why didn't they should change this ending? Like so they needed a
Yeah.
workshop group to talk about like what's going on here because they like these pieces did not come together. Um I was just
Oh,
I not surprisingly, I'm in a scuba related book group and we
oh my
just yeah,
goodness.
yeah. So it's being run by a friend and great diver who is also a PhD in ocean literature, Kelly Bushnell. Um, and she had us reading Migrations, which is this astonishing book set slightly in the future looking at climate change. And it
Mm,
follows the main characters following the last migration of the Arctic terns. It's a beautiful, beautiful book. But it is a very rare book for me that when I got to the end, I was
mhm.
thoroughly satisfied with the ending. I thought, wow, like this is the way a book should end. This pays off everything that was happening. But I'm often frustrated even with things that are published, because I see ways
Mhm.
that it could be better, both in my own writing. I cringe looking back at things that I have published previously because I see all the ways that it could be better because I know more, because I have a different idea about a turn of phrase or a
Of
way of
course.
explaining something. Um, so I think that for me, contract grading is a much better fit with my pedagogy and with how I think about writing. So what I'm really interested in is what did you want to get out of it and what did you put in to kind of get your writing to this point? And that looks different for
Mhm.
every student in terms of what their goals are.
Right, right. Oh my goodness. I I wonder for the students, how mind blowing it is to hear the way that you approach assessment. I imagine that they haven't had too many teachers along the way. And do you find that your students find it refreshing, or do you find that they're sometimes kind of grasping it? What am I supposed to do? What is the right answer? And and how do you
Yeah.
kind of help them navigate that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, first of all, there are a bunch of people in my department who are doing this. This is evolved out of a communal conversation that we've had. So, I would say it's not necessarily when students come to me, I'm not necessarily the first faculty member at LaGuardia who they're working with who's doing this. So, it's also
Hmm.
a bit of an emerging conversation as a department. Not everybody's doing it, but there are a number of us. But yeah, no, I definitely have students who are like, "What? Just tell me what I need to do to get an A." Right? And I mean that fair enough, right? I mean, when students are juggling 4 or 5 different classes, they're working full time, they're caretakers for family
Yes.
members or children, they want to know what they need to do. And so
Yeah.
I definitely have an eye towards that when I'm writing rubrics, when I'm talking with them about
Hmm.
expectations, when I'm talking with them about, what needs to happen in a class. And I think it's really important for us as faculty members to be transparent. And when possible, also to give students input into how they're going to be assessed and what's happening in the classroom because it's not my class, it's our class. But also, faculty have an institutional responsibility to be assessing student work. So I think all of
Right.
that exists on a continuum. But I think that having those conversations with students, not having what I what I think of as sort of arbitrary um, expectations about an A paper, a B paper, a C paper, I think is often very it's a relief to students. They're focused
Hmm.
on the work, they're not focused on the grade. They're focused on
Right.
the writing, they're not focused on a particular number or letter.
Hmm. And
And
do
that
you
also
find that?
frees me up in my feedback to them because then I'm really focused in
Yeah.
my feedback on the writing and on what they can achieve in a revision. And so I think that in my feedback, I'm more of a coach. And when I'm
Yeah.
more of a coach talking about their writing, I'm helping them be better writers because I'm really focusing in on here's the thing that I want you to think about, or here's a thing that would really make this piece radically
Hmm.
different.
Yeah, and I can imagine for the students too, you're probably getting much more honest reflections about the writing that than you probably would have if you had a different, if you were using a different model. Um,
Well, yeah, because talking about failure is baked into the process. It's not,
yeah,
"Oh, I failed at this." It's like, "Oh, here's where it went wrong, but here's how it could have been better." So in that sense, I mean, really much more of a studio model of writing, of thinking about, "All right, so that didn't go so well. What would you do differently next time? Or how would you revise
yeah,
this to make it go differently?"
yeah, yeah. It's important to celebrate those failures. How would we learn
Absolutely.
anything if we got it right all the time? So,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, that's great. Well, Liz, I so appreciate your time today. With your background,
Absolutely. This is fun.
so fun. To close our conversation out today, because you have such a wealth of knowledge about the ocean and the environment. You mentioned the the book earlier that had a really good ending, but is there one that you feel like everyone could really benefit from reading so that we feel very compelled to really take care of the ocean? And it could be any level, if it's one that's geared more towards young
Yes.
adults, or
I'm
yeah.
totally not gonna remember the title, so I'm gonna share the title with you
Okay.
later.
Okay.
Um,
That's fine.
but I'll tell you about the book, and then
Go for
we
it.
can put the title in the notes for this.
Yes.
I read an amazing nonfiction book about the Chesapeake Bay looking at how climate change is coming for the islands of the Chesapeake Bay, which is not how we might normally think of the Chesapeake Bay. And it really studies life on this very small island and looks at how life is changing and
Mm.
how within the next few years, the people who live on that island are going to be our first climate refugees. It's an
Yeah.
amazing book. So I will totally blank on the title because I wasn't expecting that that question today, but I will
Yeah,
share
I
it.
know, you never know what I'm gonna throw at you.
And I highly recommend it.
Thank you. Yeah, I just feel like with your experience, it's beneficial for us to learn, right? I really think until we have the opportunities to kind of feel probably what these people on this island are expecting to happen and how they're preparing for that and what it's been like there over the generations and how different it is now than maybe it was even 10 years ago or 30 years ago.
Yeah.
It helps make it real for those that aren't seeing it day to day. So that's
Yeah,
important.
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Liz. It was wonderful to talk to you today, and I hope we can
It was
stay in
great to
touch
talk to
and
you.
connect again. Yes. Take care.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Digication Scholars Conversations is brought to you by Digication, a technology platform powering the most innovative ePortfolio programs in K through 12 and higher education. Our website can be found at digication.com. This episode was produced by Drew Albanesius and Amanda Driscoll. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please like, subscribe, and share with a friend. Thanks for watching.